Supersaws are the backbone of a lot of electronic music genres, and although they're fairly easy to create in pretty much any synths, there are a few tricks and techniques that you can use to take them to the next level and create them really easily. In this video, I'm going to walk you through the process of designing your very own Supersaw sound from scratch using Wavetable inside of Ableton Live, and if you stick around to the end of the video, I'll show you how you can grab my very own Supersaw rack for yourself. Let's dive right in. Okay, so to start, let's take a listen to the sound that we're going to be creating. So to start with, we're going to have a blank MIDI track and we're going to add Ableton Live's Wavetable device to this MIDI track. Now this only comes with Ableton Live 11 Suite. If you don't have Ableton Live Suite, you'll have to buy Wavetable separately, but the concepts we're going to be going through can be applied to basically any other synthesizer. So now that we have our Wavetable loaded up, we first need to set our oscillator. And of course, for a Supersaw sound, it makes sense that we need to start with a sawtooth wave. So we're going to go to our oscillator section in Wavetable right here. Yours might start down here on the sine wave. And we're just going to set this Wavetable position slider right here to 66%, which is a pretty much perfect sawtooth wave, or as perfect as Wavetable can make it. And already we're starting to get the basis for this sound. And now we're going to add basically what is the main part of this sound, which is Unison. So we're going to go over to the bottom right-hand corner of Wavetable right here to this Unison drop-down menu, and I'm going to actually select the classic mode. You can get very similar results with some of the other modes right here, but for this, we're just going to stick to the classic mode. And now take a listen to what happens just at the default setting of 3 voices and 30% amount. We're already kind of getting that Supersaw-esque sound. To make it a little bit more super, I'm going to up the voices here to either 5 or 7. I like using an odd number here. You can use an even number if you like. Experiment with what works for you. I'm going to set the voices to 7. And now the amount control controls the amount of detune between these different copies of our sawtooth wave that we're creating with this Unison option. At a lower amount, we have no detuning, but it does still sound pretty cool. And as we increase this amount, we're going to detune these oscillators more from each other and end up with that more buzzy bee-like sound until we get all the way to 100%, where it's really intense, which can work really well for certain electronic dance music genres, of course. But I'm going to leave this amount maybe around kind of 60-ish%, which works quite well for this sound. To add a little bit more grit to this sound, I'm actually going to go to the filter section here, and I'm going to engage the drive in our first filter. So in order to do this, I need to set the low pass filter to some kind of different filter circuit other than clean. So I'm going to go to this drop down menu right here, choose any of these different ones. I'm going to choose MS2. That tends to sound quite nice. Any of the other ones do sound pretty good too. And I'm going to now set the drive amount here to maybe about 5 dB. So obviously this will make the sound a little bit louder, but we'll also add some distortion, some extra harmonics, some saturation, which works really well for these types of sounds. From here, we've kind of got to decide what type of sound we want to create. This Supersaw is the basis for a lot of different types of sounds, from pads to plucks, and we can create them all and shape all these sounds using our amplitude envelope. So what I'm going to do here is go to the amplitude envelope, and as you'll see, if I increase the attack and increase the release, we now start to get more of like a pad sound. And if I decrease the attack and decrease the sustain and maybe play around with the decay right here, we get a bit more of a plucky type sound. For this particular sound, because I want kind of just stabby chords, I'm going to increase the sustain all the way up and set my release to around 50 milliseconds. And the reason I'm setting it to 50 milliseconds as opposed to pulling it all the way down is because when it's all the way down, you can occasionally get some clicks and pops and stuff at the ends of the notes, which I don't really like, so I'm setting it to 50 milliseconds. And now we have a good sound to use for those types of chords that we heard in the example. Now let's take this a step further by adding a second oscillator. So I'm going to go into the second oscillator section here in Wavetable, click on this little button right here and engage our second oscillator. I'm also now going to set this second oscillator to a sawtooth wave, set the wavetable position to 66%. And with this second oscillator, I actually want it to be playing an octave higher so that we get a more full frequency spectrum sound. To do this, I'm going to set the semitone relationship of this oscillator to plus 12 semitones. So go to the semitones, type in 12 right here, and now you'll hear we effectively have 2 octaves of sawtooth waves when we play a single note. Let's change the balance of this higher octave to our normal octave using the volume control right here. And somewhere around kind of -5, -6 dB tends to be pretty good for this. Because it's higher, it tends to sound a little bit louder to us. So you want it a little bit softer in terms of the actual gain of the oscillator. Now we're going to add some movement to the sound with the low pass filter in filter 1. You'll often hear these types of sounds have a little bit of like a plucky characteristic at the start, especially when there's some filter movement going on. So let's go to this filter 1 right here, which is currently set to a low pass filter, meaning that's cutting out the high frequencies, passing the low frequencies. And as I reduce this frequency control, take a listen to what happens. Now this by itself can sound really cool and you might not want to add any filter movement, but if you do want to add some movement to this filter automatically, we're going to do this using the second envelope right here. So you'll need some kind of modulation envelope in your synth. I'm going to go to envelope 2, click on that, and now we're going to adjust the envelope parameters here to kind of mimic the movement that we want for this filter. I'm going to pull the sustain all the way down right here. I'm going to pull the attack all the way down as well, so it's really, really fast. And I'm actually going to set the release quite long. And the reason for this is that I don't want the filter envelope cutting off before our amplitude envelope because it can sound a little bit strange when that happens. So I'm just going to increase the release to at least what I've got the release set to in the amplitude envelope. So now in order to map this envelope to this filter, I'm going to go to our matrix, click on the filter frequency control, and now I'm going to go to this filter 1 frequency target, envelope 2, and just increase this 100%. Now as I play a note, have a listen and look at what happens at the filter. And you'll really hear this, especially when I reduce this filter frequency control all the way down. We get that really kind of plucky, filtered sound. Now, one little quirk about Wavetable is that we can't actually automate this modulation amount, but what we can do if you want a little bit less pluckiness is you can go into the envelope 2 section, which is the envelope that's controlling this filter. We can go to the value section and we can just change the peak value of the envelope to adjust effectively how much the filter opens at the start of this envelope. And you can automate this parameter, so if you want to change that over time, you're more than welcome to use that particular control. Now, of course, you don't need a plucky characteristic here. You can also add some attack with the envelope to get more of like a wubby sound, which can also sound really cool on chords. And if you want some more interesting kind of squelchy movement, you can always increase the resonance control of the filter as well, which can end up with a really interesting, kind of more old school type sound. I'm going to turn this down for the moment. I don't really like that. I'm also going to set this attack all the way back to 0 because I want that kind of plucky sound. And I'm also now going to increase the frequency a little bit right here because I don't want it to close completely. Next, I want to add some movement to the pitch of this sound. And to do this, I'm going to use envelope 3 in a very similar manner to what we used envelope 2 for with the filter. I'm going to go to envelope 3 right here, pull the sustain all the way down, pull the attack all the way down, and I'm also going to pull the decay down quite significantly. Now, what I'm trying to do here with this envelope is add a little bit of punch and click to the start of this sound. So I'm going to have this quite short here. We can play around with this after we've mapped it. I'm going to go back into the matrix, and then I'm going to map the pitch to this envelope 3. So let's increase this by maybe say 12 semitones. And now you should hear a little bit of a click at the start of this sound. Let's increase it all the way up to 48 and go back into this envelope 3 right here so you can really hear what this is doing. And this can be a really fantastic way to add an extra bit of punch to your sound. And it also works really well if you want to have the filter entirely open. You still get that kind of punch and click at the start of the sound. Again, like we did with our other envelope on the filter, we can go to the value control right here, and we can modulate or automate this peak control to adjust the depth of this modulation. And this is the basis for the sound, but now we get to add some effects, which is where we can really bring this sound to life. The first effect I'm gonna add here is some compression. So I'm gonna add just Ableton Live's standard glue compressor right here. Now the reason I'm adding compression here is because I like to have a lot of movement to my Supersaw sounds over the course of a track, which involves pulling down the filter, maybe adjusting things like the envelope attached to the filter as well. And all of this can really change the dynamic range of the sound. When the filter's down, the sound can get really lost, and when the filter's all the way open, the sound can get blown way out of proportion. So that's why I like to have a compressor right here, and I just pull down the threshold until I'm maybe applying about 5 dB of gain reduction, and we pull up the makeup gain a little bit to compensate as well. You can of course adjust the attack and release to your liking as well, but if you don't understand compression, don't worry about it too much. You can pretty much leave these settings all as is here on the left. The only thing I would recommend if you're using the glue compressor is just go up to this clip section in the top right and make sure this little soft button is engaged. And that will stop the signal from going over 0 decibels at the end of the compressor, and it can also add some nice extra crunch and distortion to the signal too. Next, a lot of people like to also add some over-the-top compression in the form of Ableton Live's OTT preset, or you can use X for Records OTT plugin or anything else like that. This can work really nicely, especially for those much more compressed and dense supersaws that you'll hear in really compressed genres, maybe like drum and bass or dubstep or something like that. So what I'm going to do is go and search OTT, and I'm going to add the OTT preset here. Now, if you don't know what OTT is doing, don't stress too much. It's just effectively really intense compression. And right out of the gate, it sounds probably far too intense. As you can hear there, it's really squashed the signal. So what I'm actually going to do is just pull down the amount control until I kind of like where it's sitting. And that will probably be about 30% for me. If I turn it off, turn it back on, you can hear it's kind of leveled out the frequency spectrum a little bit more. If you don't like this, you really don't have to use it, but it can work really well for certain types of genres. You might also want to increase the output just a little bit, again, to compensate for the amount of compression that you're applying. But again, there's no need to use this effect if you really don't want to. Next up, I'm going to add some EQ. Now, you don't need to go crazy with the EQ here unless you're kind of looking at mixing this in with other sounds. And in fact, I'm not going to go crazy with the EQ, and I'm just going to add Ableton Live's channel EQ for this. So let's add a channel EQ right here. And channel EQ is a really simple 3-band EQ. And what this is going to allow us to do is just change the balance of different frequencies relative to one another. So often with these types of sounds, you want it a little bit more bitey. And in order to do that, I'm just going to increase the high frequencies here by probably about 2 to 3 dB. You might want a little bit less kind of in the mid range. So you might want to pull down the mids by maybe 2 dB and set the mid frequency maybe to somewhere around 600 hertz could work pretty well. And you might find that you also want to high pass this sound depending on what kind of role it's playing in your track. If it's playing a bass sound, no need to high pass it, but you might want to clean up some low frequencies that are potentially introduced with some distortion and stuff like that. For this, I'm going to engage that high pass, and now we get a little bit more of a different sound. Again, this EQ is totally over to your taste. You might even want to add some mid frequencies in here to add some body to the sound. And in fact, let's leave it like that for the moment. Now I'm going to add some distortion. I'm going to add some really subtle distortion in the form of a saturator. So I'm going to add Ableton Live's saturated device right here. And all I'm going to do is just increase the drive a little bit by maybe 3 to 5 dB. I'm going to make sure this soft clip here is turned on, and then you can also adjust your output here to compensate. So let's set our drive to 5 dB. Now it's obviously gotten much louder, which can work really well. And now to put this sound in more of a space, we can add some delay and reverb. I'm going to add a delay, and you can change the parameters of this delay however you want, and it will totally depend on whatever role this sound is playing in your track. Here, I'm going to set this delay to 1/8 notes, pull down the dry wet a little bit, maybe pull down the feedback a little bit, and set it to ping pong. And now we have a sound like this. For From here, of course, you can add some reverb as well. So let's add some really basic reverb, adjust the parameters, maybe pull down the dry wet a little bit, increase the decay to maybe 2.5 seconds, maybe increase the pre-delay a little bit, and you can adjust any other parameters to your liking as well. And now that we've added most of the effects that we need, we can go back and we can adjust the parameters in any of these other effects. Maybe I've got a little bit too much distortion going on, maybe a little bit too much compression in this OTT, maybe a little bit too much normal compression as well. And potentially you might want to even adjust these EQs and stuff. From here, you can also add some other layers like a noise layer to really crisp up the high end and a sub layer to fill out that low end. But this is the basis for this particular sound. Now, don't get me wrong, I love designing these types of sounds from scratch, but I often find myself starting with really similar starting positions like I just showed you here. And so I've made an instrument rack for myself that I use that has most of the common parameters mapped to macros, makes use of some of the common effects that I showed, and also has some presets in the form of macro variations to make it really quick and easy and efficient to use. If you want to grab the rack for yourself, there'll be a link in the description where you can do so, but I just wanted to give you a quick, brief overview of what this rack looks like and how it works. So here is the rack, and by default, it sounds like this, which is just a really nice, simple Supersaw sound. And as you can see here, we've got kind of two main racks inside of this core rack. We have this actual instrument rack here, which has the Wavetable instrument inside of it, and this shaper one, which has a bunch of audio effects to shape the sound. In the main instrument rack, we have a few presets right here. This classic one is what we start on, which is just a really simple Supersaw. You've got a full one, which has a noise layer, an octave higher layer, and a sub layer added. And then you've got some other presets like a wubby type sound, a Hoover type sound, and then more of like a sync-esque type sound that has zero detune whatsoever, which can sound really cool in certain applications. Now, of course, we get the ability to control the parameters of the wavetables that are in here as well, such as the attack, decay, sustain, and release of the main synth. So we can create more of a pad-like sound. You've got some filter controls as well, the ability to control the filter cutoff and the filter envelope amount, as well as the filter envelope attack and the resonance of the filter. The decay of the filter envelope here is actually linked to the decay of the amplitude envelope, because typically you'll want them linked as well. You've got some pitch envelope controls here, some unison, sub, and octave level controls, as well as the addition of a noise layer, which you can increase the level of, as well as apply a high pass filter too, which can really help to just introduce some extra crispy high end into the sound. And then we have the effects rack here, which has a bunch of really common effects. We have a chorus, some compression, and some OTT. Some really basic EQ with some high gain and some mid gain, some high pass filtering and some low pass filtering. Some distortion and stereo width controls. And then some really simple delay and reverb controls. And then we get the ability to adjust the output level here as well. In case it's a little bit too loud, you can of course go in there and adjust the instruments and effects to your liking as well beyond the macros, but it serves really well as a starting point for a Supersaw in a track. Now, a quick disclaimer, if you do grab this instrument rack, it might change a little bit and I might update it over time, in which case it might be a little bit different to what you've seen here in this video, but it should be pretty functionally the same as well. And if anything, it will just be slightly improved. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to leave a like down below, subscribe if you're new, and if you want to grab that Supersaw rack, you can do so over on my Buy Me a Coffee page. I'll leave a link to that down in the description. If you want to learn some more cool sound design techniques using Wavetable, check out this video right here. Otherwise, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed, I hope you learned something, and I'll see you all in the next video.